I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we are going to dye a new yarn base that is extraordinarily unique, at least based on what I have dyed and the blends I have dyed in the past. Wool to Dye-Force Egyptian fingering weight yarn is 50% alpaca, 25% silk, 25% linen. So not only do we have protein fibers and cellulose fibers, but there's also silk. And so all of this is just really exciting to me. And I have no idea what to expect with how it'll absorb color. This yarn is really, really soft. And I imagine that it has some strength and durability to it from the linen being there, but also from the silk. Silk is a very strong fiber, at least when it comes to spinning, because when a blend has silk in it, I'm like, ooh, that'll be easier to spin because the staple length is pretty long. I don't think I would have expected a linen blend to be this soft, but it is really, really soft. Color-wise, I mean, you can see a few of like linen strands sort of like sticking out because it is a bit of a coarser fiber. Color-wise, it is on par with a lot of bare yarn. When designing this video, I was trying to think about what I could dye beside it. And my mind went from like wool silk blends to alpaca silk blends, if I even had one, or even just alpaca yarn. But ultimately, I decided to focus on a few blends that have a combination of protein fibers and cellulose fibers. So we're going to dye this Egyptian fingering alongside Knit Picks Galileo, which is 50% merino, 50% viscose from bamboo, and Nomad's Asperitas, which is 50% recycled wool, 50% tencel. I have a feeling that our two 50-50 protein cellulose fiber bases will dye up a bit differently from the Egyptian fingering, but I think that this is the best kind of comparison that I could think of. In all three of these yarns, we have cellulose-based fiber, viscose, tencel, or linen. And that fiber will not pick up color from acid dyes. It might get a little bit of staining, but it isn't going to be dyed with those colors. The protein content will. And so I expect that in all three cases, our final yarn will have heathered qualities to it because different fibers in the blends will absorb the colors differently. And honestly, I'm extremely curious to see how they will turn out. But to get started, I want to make sure we give this yarn a really nice long soak. So I'm going to pre-soak all of the yarn overnight in some plain tap water. I pre-soaked all of our yarn overnight. I did not scour it. So that means I did not like wash it with, say, soap to remove oils and things of that nature. I have dyed Galileo and the Asperitas in the past without scouring, so I figured let's try with our Egyptian fingering here in the middle. And today we are going to do some immersion coloring using dry powder and just see where this takes us. But I did want to just show there is some slight discoloration in the pre-soak water, and I'm not sure which base that's from. I just added 8 cups of tap water with 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. This is a reasonable amount of water. We are not that low immersion. The colors that we add will spread, but with the fiber contents in here, I would have expected that anyway because everything here is non-superwash. And so we're gonna take 3 colors, layer them on, and see what the colors want to do. So I'm gonna start heating things up. And once it's warm, we can start adding the color. Today we are going to use 3 different Dharma acid dyes, Fluorescent Fuschia, Cherry Bomb, and Royal Purple onto our yarn. Whenever I am dealing with the dry dye powder, I will be wearing my deluxe rubber respirator mask with P100 filters, safety glasses, and gloves. And for all the dye that's on my gloved fingertips, I have a yarn mop. This is some Knit Picks Stroll fingering weight yarn that I quickly dunked in some water with 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. So it's only a little bit damp, but I will wipe my gloved fingers off on here to leave no dye behind. Okay, I'm going to reduce the heat to low. We're on top of 2 gas burners on my stove. And now starting with the Fluorescent Fuschia, I am just going to add some pops of color, and we'll see how things spread. I'm not going for something necessarily that's mega repeating, but I'm going a little bit less random, at least at first, than what I might often do. But I am curious how these different colors may feel on these quite different bases. You know, how they may or may not spread and things like that. I mean, it's hard to compare them because the twist in them is all different. The thickness is a little different. So it's more of just how do the colors like look, maybe saturation wise, is something that we'll be able to explore a little bit. But I'm kind of making up this pattern. This is the cherry bomb as we go along, and I have a feeling I'll go more random on the flips and not necessarily stick with this patterning. But my goal is to add some of each color to each skein. The fluorescent fuchsia is spreading out a ton. That is what that color does. So that is not unusual. Now, I'm going pretty, well, I'm not going that heavy in terms of like where the specks are on the yarn. It is a little bit heavy, but I'm not adding like a ton of dye. So, you know, things may spread, but this isn't like that much color. But I guess the coverage is fairly heavy-ish. I don't know. Again, we may order things differently once we flip. But I did want to get just sort of an initial impression on how these colors behave on these blends. Ooh, it looks like that that deep purple, the royal purple, does break, which is fun to see. So at this stage, I'm going to go ahead. Guys, I'm debating. Part of me wants to touch it and move things. I'm not going to. We may do that later on, but for this round, I'm not going to. I'm going to let things sit at least 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and see how things look. But again, we have our Asperitas, our Egyptian fingering, and then our Galileo. It's been approximately 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, the colors spread the most on the Asperitas, the wool tencel blend. They spread a medium amount on the Egyptian fingering, which is our alpaca silk linen blend. And then they spread the least, remaining more where we place the colors on the Galileo, the 50-50 wool viscose from bamboo blend. And so I'm not sure how much this has to do with the twists versus the fiber content, but it is interesting to see the colors increase in clarity almost and feel less blurred when you go further up the pan. Let's just flip. Whoa. Then move it. Lots of color. Lots of color coming and moving. On superwash wool, the 10 minutes is enough time that when I got to this stage that the colors would have set more. So that is, well, to be expected. Again, everything here is non-superwash. But oh, I guess I didn't talk a ton. The cherry bomb is a bit blown out. And a lot of the other colors also are just feeling a wee bit softer. But that is totally fine. And we're going to create something very, very beautiful in here. Nevertheless. Sometimes I am so focused on what I'm doing that I forget what I was doing. Okay, I'm adding just a little bit more of the fluorescent fuchsia. I know that each of these, well, I don't know about the Egyptian fingering, but I know that these other colors can end up looking very nice and saturated depending on the color used. So I'm just very intrigued and interested, and this time I'm going a lot more random with the color placement. And I could come in and move things a bit with a spoon, but I don't think that there is a ton of need for that because I think that the colors have a little bit of time to set somewhat, because clearly not all of the dye moved out when I flipped. But there's time for it to settle in, and then we'll get like this beautiful softness overall, which I am excited about. So once again, we're going to wait about 10 minutes and then we'll decide if we want more color. While we're waiting, I want to take this moment to give a huge thank you to all of the ChemKnits Fiber patrons, including Karen Siegel, Tamara Svanes, Don Jans, Jessica Parco, and the rest of the names you see on the screen right now. Patreon is a platform that connects viewers with content creators and is a great way to help support the content that you see. In exchange, you can get some really cool perks like early access to the Dyepot PS series and more. Go and check out the ChemKnits Patreon page at patreon.com/ChemKnits for more details. But the biggest way that you can help support the content here is by subscribing. So please make sure you're subscribed. I do not yet know if we are going to need more color on this yarn, but right now the Galileo, maybe it's sticking further out, but you can see more discrete color there. Let's go ahead and flip it just briefly. Ooh, I see a lot of pink there. Flip it briefly. Ooh, lots of color there too. Before we decide to bring things inside out to see whether or not we need more color. And all right, I would say that there's a lot of color around that Asperitas that is not set. And let's see here. I mean, again, there's a lot of color left in here. And the Galileo, I think, maybe doing the best at soaking up the color. Yeah, it's the one that has the most visible, like, pastel areas remaining. But I think I'm not going to add more color because we're not quite sure what we may see. And I'm not going to want to spend forever rinsing all of these. So I'm going to add, this is some water that had some white vinegar in it already. But I am going to also add 1, 2, 3 more tablespoons of white vinegar. So I probably added, with all that water, 4.5 to 5 tablespoons. And now we are going to heat this up so we can try to set the rest of this color. And as for our yarn mop, I'm going to go ahead and steam this in a steamer basket for 30 minutes when one becomes available. It has been over 30 minutes, and I would say we're looking a lot more purple down there on the Asperitas, and I see more variation in color on the Galileo. Okay, so the color is looking fairly clear up there, but down here, oh goody, we are also starting to clear a bit, which is really, really good. When I checked in before, it was still quite purple, and a deep purple at that. And there is more pigment down on that side, which is why I'm now coming in. Well, I'm flipping the yarn, but I'm also giving everything a chance to move around in there. And so I would say I am very intrigued to see what all these will look like in the end. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn off the heat, leave everything in here to cool completely. And so it'll take a while, but we'll have a long period of time still with heat on the yarn. And once things cool, then we'll see if we still see some pink in the dye bath or not. I let the yarn cool overnight, and let's see, crossing our fingers, but I mean, that's looking good. One of the zip ties came undone. I see maybe the tiniest hint of pink in the water, but that also could be some pink along the back wall there. So I'm going to check. I mean, there's a little bit of pink Can you see? Just the tiniest hint. But let's go wash the yarn. And we gotta remember that the yarn is non-superwash. So we don't want to be too rough. But the other content in here, we won't get a complete felted mess because the cellulose fibers shouldn't felt. But that doesn't mean you can't felt, that we couldn't felt the wool. So worth taking care. But the good news is that that's about like what I saw in the dye bath, and so it's barely nothing. I'm washing on cool water, and I'm going to add just a little bit of some clear dish soap to the rinse bath. Fluorescent Fuschia is a color that can be a bleeder, and that's one reason why I wanted to include it here, just to see what would happen. Because if the cellulose fiber in any of these bases absorbs kind of that color like a sponge, but the color doesn't strike, then we could see some bleeding now. But I mean, this is great because we're not seeing any bleeding. So I am going to go ahead. Oof, it is really cold. Oh, maybe there's a hair. Actually, I see a hair. So I'm going to do another rinse. I'll fill this up and then come show you. Okay, let's see. We could also just do some nice soaks. Need to make sure to hold the zip tie that is loose in the correct way. But the amount of color I see in the water is not concerning me. So I'm gonna go ahead and rinse this, I think, a couple more times, letting it soak in between each rinse. But then I'll put the yarn through my spin dryer so we can hang it up to dry and see what these colors look like. But I would say first impressions, I see a lot of beautiful variation in the Egyptian fingering. And the Egyptian fingering and the Galileo look very similar to me right now. The Asperitas looks deeper. The colors all blended a lot more. And I do see a little bit of speckling on the Egyptian fingering. So anyway, I'll check back in maybe even after we come out of the spin dryer to see if I notice anything. Out of the spin dryer, the Galileo is still looking a lot lighter. But now I think the Egyptian fingering feels more like the Asperitas than the Galileo, but maybe it does have some lighter pink patches, so maybe there is still a little more variation. But all of them are a bit lighter now because that tends to be what happens with cellulose cotton blends. And let's wash our yarn mop. I really, really enjoy the random colorways I get by wiping my fingers onto yarn. The random placement, I don't know, it just really excites me as a fun, non-repeating colorway. But let's add a little bit of some dish soap. And sometimes when I'm doing this, I like to leave the yarn to soak in the water for a bit. Seeing maybe a tiny hint of some color, but not bad. Sometimes when I'm not filming, I will leave the yarn to soak for a little bit in between washes, and even sometimes when I'm filming the washing. It all just depends on what's in the schedule, honestly. But, alright, I'm not seeing any color. I'm going to finish rinsing out the soap, put this through the spin dryer, and hang it up to dry with the rest of the yarn. Looking on my monitor, I'm not sure how much you feel the differences between the three bases. We have the Asperitas, the Egyptian fingering, and then our Galileo here. The Asperitas definitely feels the deepest in terms of overall tone. It also feels like the one where the colors have blended the most. Yes, we do have some small patches of color, but I see some things on the Galileo and on the Egyptian fingering that more resemble speckles. Like here with the deeper purple, you really see that on the Galileo. And on the Egyptian fingering, you can feel it in with some of the red, where we have some shorter color changes in there. As a quick reminder of the fiber content, the Galileo is 50% merino, 50% viscose from bamboo. The Asperitas is 50% recycled wool, 50% tencel. And our Egyptian fingering is 50% baby alpaca, 25% silk, 25% linen, which is still, I think, one of the most unique yarn bases I have ever felt ever. I'm trying to pick a slightly more saturated version of the Galileo, Egyptian fingering, and Asperitas, so that way you can kind of see a little bit of the heathering, which I think is the most obvious in the Galileo. You can see how there are both dark strands and light strands in there. The Asperitas, you also feel the difference of the color within the twist itself because of the way the different fibers are absorbing color differently. Looking at the Egyptian fingering, and granted, this one is only 25% plant fiber, it's a little harder to see. Oh, here's a deeper section with some red. So in here you can almost see a little bit coarser section of some of the linen come through. And so that heathering is still there. It's just maybe because it's a little bit thinner than the others, it's a little bit less obvious, but still present. I've had a few questions recently on whether or not on one of these yarn bases you could dye it with acid dyes and then dye it with fiber reactive dyes. So that way you're just dyeing the protein fibers at one point and then just dyeing the cellulose fibers at another point. And unfortunately, it doesn't quite work that way. With fiber reactive dyes, you can use them like acid dyes if you use citric acid or vinegar to dye wool yarn. However, even if you have the soda ash present, it's still gonna bind to the wool yarn. Maybe not as well as the cellulose fibers, but I've done tie-dyeing experiments where I've dyed side by side wool and cotton yarn, not blends, and they both do take up color. Furthermore, soda ash and really high pH conditions can damage wool fibers, and so therefore it's not necessarily recommended. However, this is something I would be willing to test out. I don't think that doing the acid dyes and fiber reactive dyes would make a huge difference because, as I said, the fiber reactive dyes would likely dye both. But I am willing to dye, like say the Asperitas or Galileo with fiber reactive dyes, see if it looks heathered, and then if that color was light enough, we could try dyeing with acid dyes on top of that to try to make the wool content a bit deeper in color and see what kind of effects that has. And so I would go about it in that way, doing fiber reactive dyes first and then acid dyes. But if you did the fiber reactive dyes in too dark of a color, I don't think that anything you did with acid dyes would be able to add on top of it. So this is a little bit long-winded. I think that there is an interesting idea there. It may or may not work, but certainly is something that I should test out because honestly, I need to push myself to play with my fiber reactive dyes more anyway. For some reason, and I think it's because I'm just concerned about them staining my clothes more, I am so much more nervous to use fiber reactive dyes than I am to use acid dyes. And this is purely because I have not used them as much. With the other additional asterisk that I don't like all the washing that I have to do after tie-dyeing cotton yarn because there's always washing. So I think those are the two reasons why I have not done that more, but it's something that I absolutely need to do. What would I use these protein cellulose blends for? I honestly don't know. They're just like unique, interesting yarn blends. And the Egyptian fingering is soft, but it also has like a coarseness. It's not coarse, it's very, very soft. It feels like it would be strong. It has amazing, amazing drape to it. I mean, I could see making some kind of like lacy tank or something with it that would have some strength, but I'm not sure why. Maybe do just linen silk blends exist? I think that's something that exists. That seems something like you'd want for summery. So I'm not really sure. I guess the wool adds a little bit of memory to the garment, a little bit of stretch and bounce. Maybe the alpaca too, although this, I don't think the Egyptian fingering is particularly bouncy. But the Asperitas and Galileo are bouncier. So that's maybe why having that wool in addition to the cellulose blend makes sense. And certainly the colors are beautiful and fun. So I'm not really sure. And if you've used them and if you love using these types of yarn, please let me know in the comments below, because I'm very, very intrigued and want to play with all of these more in the future. I want to give another massive thank you to all of the ChemKnits patrons for supporting the content here on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel and helping make this Dyepot PS series a possibility. I love getting your feedback and having you pick the direction for these videos. And yeah, this Egyptian fingering has been sitting in my stash way too long, and I'm so glad I finally dyed it. If you want to become a ChemKnits patron, go and find more information at patreon.com/ChemKnits. There will be a link down in the video description. Of course, the biggest way you can support the content here is by subscribing. So please make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications so you never miss any videos. I post at least twice a week and often more. And we have lots of fun special events coming up, and you don't want to miss any of it. I can't believe I almost forgot the yarn mop. It's funny how bright these colors are compared to the more muted tones we have on our cellulose blends. It did pain me a bit to not have just like a superwash merino blend in the pan with these other ones for comparison. And so this isn't the best comparison because on the yarn mop, the colors aren't really blended. You see more of them separately, but it doesn't really look that related to the other colors, which amuses me. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching.